It was supposed to be a night of laughter, candles, and family. My dad had just turned 60, and we gathered at his home to celebrate. The dining room was full of chatter and the smell of roasted chicken. Everyone seemed happy, at least on the surface. But when my phone buzzed and I saw my daughter's name, her trembling voice whispered words that froze my blood. "Mom, get out of the house now. Stick with me while I share my story. And if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about." My name is Renee Walsh. That night, I was sitting at the table beside my husband, Evan, and my stepmother, Clara. Clara had married my dad 2 years ago after my mom passed away. I never fully trusted her, but I tried for my dad's sake. Clara was charming on the outside, but something about her always felt fake. During dinner, I noticed how Clara kept leaning toward Evan, laughing too much at his jokes. Their eyes met one too many times. It made my stomach twist, but I brushed it off. My dad adored her, and I didn't want to ruin his special night. When my daughter Lila called me from upstairs, her voice was shaky. "Mom," she said softly, "please get out of the house." I felt my chest tighten. "Lila, what's going on?" she whispered. "Dad isn't who you think he is. He and Grandma Clara, they're together." My world stopped. I looked across the table. Clara's hand was under the table, resting on Evan's knee. The way he froze when our eyes met told me everything. My husband was having an affair with my stepmother. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream or throw the cake like part of me wanted to. I smiled tightly, took Lila's hand, and told everyone we needed to leave early. Dad just smiled, thinking I was tired. He had no idea his wife had betrayed both of us. That night, I packed our bags. Evan came home late, pretending everything was normal. I didn't speak to him. I simply left with Lila and went to stay at a friend's house. For weeks, he called and texted, begging to talk. Clara even messaged me, pretending to be worried. I ignored them both. I needed to think and plan. Then I remembered something. My dad had trusted Clara to handle part of his finances. She had connected some of his accounts with Evan's business. I started going through old files and found what I needed: proof of money transfers and fake signatures. Clara and Evan weren't just cheating, they were stealing. I went straight to my dad and showed him everything. His face went pale. He called his lawyer the same day. Within a week, Clara's lies came crashing down. She lost everything. Evan's business collapsed, and both of them faced fraud charges. Evan tried to come back, crying and apologizing. I looked at him and said, "You and Clara deserve each other." That was the last time I saw him. A year later, Dad is rebuilding his life, and so am I. Lila is stronger, wiser, and proud of me. Sometimes betrayal breaks you, but sometimes it sets you free. My name is Renee Walsh, and that evening we were celebrating my dad's 60th birthday at his house in the countryside. The place looked beautiful, golden lights across the porch, the smell of apple pie in the air, and the sound of laughter echoing from the living room. My dad loved having the whole family together, and for him, I tried to act cheerful. Evan stood beside Clara, pouring her a glass of wine. They laughed quietly at something I couldn't hear. The way they looked at each other made me feel uneasy. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Maybe they were just being friendly, I thought. Still, a strange feeling sat heavy in my chest. Clara had always been a polished woman, perfect hair, expensive perfume, the kind of charm that draws people in. My dad adored her and trusted her with everything. I never said much, but I always kept my distance. Evan, on the other hand, seemed a little too comfortable around her that night. His hand brushed hers when he handed her a plate, and she didn't move away. Instead, she smiled softly. My heart gave a sharp ache I couldn't explain. As everyone settled at the long wooden table, I sat beside my dad, pretending to enjoy the warmth of the evening. Lila was chatting with her grandfather, and for a moment, it almost felt normal. But then I saw Clara glance toward Evan again. It wasn't a casual look. It was something secret, something that didn't belong between two married people. Dad started telling an old story from his childhood, his laughter filling the room. Everyone joined in, except me. I could barely hear him. My eyes were fixed on Evan and Clara as they exchanged a quick smile when they thought no one noticed. My stomach turned again. I forced myself to focus on the celebration, cutting cake and passing out plates, but I couldn't ignore the growing tension. The air felt thick. Every time I caught their eyes meeting, my pulse quickened. Something was happening, and even though I didn't know what, I could feel it pressing at the edge of the evening. Later, while we all moved to the patio, Clara placed her hand on Evan's arm to guide him toward the wine table. It was such a small gesture, but it stung. I saw how easily his body leaned toward her, how naturally they stood close. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. I laughed at something Dad said, trying to steady my voice. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The laughter, the music, the lights, it all felt like a cover hiding something darker. I could feel the ground shifting beneath the smiles. As the night went on, I caught Evan looking at me once, his eyes uncertain, almost guilty. He quickly looked away when Clara spoke to him. My heart sank. That uneasy feeling grew stronger, curling inside me like a warning I didn't yet understand. Something was about to change, and I could feel it coming. Clara had been part of our family for only 2 years, yet she acted as if she had always belonged there. That night, her attention toward Evan felt stronger than ever. She stayed close to him, offering food before anyone else, touching his shoulder lightly when she spoke. Each little gesture seemed innocent on its own, but together they felt wrong. Evan laughed at her jokes, the kind of laugh that used to belong to me. His eyes sparkled when she spoke, and she seemed to enjoy every second of his attention. My dad, sitting at the head of the table, was smiling proudly, unaware of what was happening in front of him. He looked at Clara as if she were the best thing that had ever happened to him. Seeing that love made my stomach twist even tighter. Clara poured more wine into Evan's glass, even when he hadn't asked. He protested politely, but she insisted, smiling sweetly as if it were some private game between them. I tried to distract myself by helping Lila with dessert, but every time I looked up, I caught them sharing another quiet glance. It was like watching something unfold behind a curtain, just out of reach. When Clara spoke, her tone toward Evan was soft, warmer than it should have been. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, pretending to whisper something funny. Evan smiled, not even noticing how obvious they looked. I bit my lip, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't want to ruin the evening for my dad. He had waited weeks for this celebration, and I refused to spoil it because of my doubts. Still, the tension wouldn't leave. Every time Clara laughed, it felt too loud, too eager. Every time Evan responded, his eyes lingered too long. The air between them was full of something unspoken, and I could feel it pressing against me like a storm waiting to break. Dad started telling a story from his younger days, and everyone listened with warm smiles. But Clara's attention never left Evan. She nodded at my father, but her body stayed angled toward my husband. Her hand brushed against his arm as she reached for her drink, and I saw him flinch, then look away quickly. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I was tired, maybe I was jealous without reason. But the feeling in my chest wouldn't fade. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. I had known Evan for 12 years, and I could read him easily. That night, his eyes looked different, nervous, uncertain, almost guilty. I smiled through it all, pretending not to notice. On the outside, I looked calm, polite, and pleasant. But deep inside, I was trembling. My father's laughter filled the room, the candles flickered across the table, and everyone appeared happy. Yet behind every smile, there was a tension I couldn't ignore. It was the kind of unease that stays even when the noise fades. The kind that whispers in the back of your mind, telling you the truth you don't want to face. Something was happening, and soon, I would no longer be able to look away. The knife was halfway through the cake when my phone began to vibrate against the table. The laughter around me softened, but I didn't look right away. It was Lila's name glowing on the screen. I excused myself quietly, stepping away from the crowd, the sound of candles being blown out fading behind me. When I answered, her voice was trembling. "Mom," she whispered, "you need to get out of the house. Now." A chill ran through me. My hands went cold as I moved toward the hallway, away from where everyone could hear. "Lila, what are you talking about?" My voice came out lower than I expected, my breath unsteady. There was silence for a moment, just her uneven breathing on the other end. Then she said the words that made everything around me spin. "Dad isn't who you think he is. He and Grandma Clara, they're together." I froze, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. The walls around me seemed to blur. For a few seconds, I couldn't process what she meant. Together? That couldn't be right. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe she saw something innocent and got it wrong. But the sound in her voice told me she hadn't. She was scared. "Lila, where are you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. She said she was in one of the upstairs rooms. She had gone there to get her sweater, but heard voices through the half-open guest room. "They were talking like they didn't care who heard," she whispered. "Dad told her he couldn't stop thinking about her." I didn't mean to listen, Mom, but I was scared. My knees felt weak. I leaned against the wall, staring toward the dining room where the people I loved were laughing over cake. My dad's voice rose above the others, joyful, proud. Clara's laugh followed, warm, practiced, hollow. Evan's joined hers. The sound of it made my stomach twist. I told Lila to stay upstairs, lock the door, and wait. My voice shook as I hung up. I couldn't walk back into that room right away. I needed a moment to breathe, to gather the pieces of what I had just heard. The air felt heavier now, every sound sharper. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, it all seemed distant, unreal. When I finally looked back through the doorway, I saw them, Evan and Clara, standing close, whispering. Her hand brushed his sleeve as she smiled up at him. He smiled back, small but familiar, the same smile that used to make me feel love. The truth hit me so hard it almost knocked the air from my lungs. Everything that had felt strange all evening suddenly made sense. The quiet glances, the shared laughter, the nervous energy. It wasn't in my head. It was real. I forced my face into a calm expression and walked back toward the table, my pulse hammering beneath my skin. My dad looked up, cheerful and unaware. No one else noticed the way my world had just shattered. And right then, I knew the night was far from over. I stood there, watching the people I loved most sitting around that glowing table, laughing as if nothing in the world could touch them. The flickering candles danced across Clara's perfect smile and Evan's easy grin. For a second, I wanted to believe my daughter had been wrong, that this was just a misunderstanding. But then I saw it, Clara's hand, hidden beneath the tablecloth, resting lightly on Evan's knee. His fingers twitched but didn't move hers away. That single motion told me everything I needed to know. My breath caught in my throat. Every moment from the past few months came rushing back. The sudden business trips, the way Evan started guarding his phone, the excuses about late meetings. The distance between us had grown slowly, quietly, like a shadow that I ignored. Now it all made sense. The truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was right there in front of me, wrapped in fake smiles and warm laughter. I couldn't move. My dad was telling a story from his younger days, completely unaware of the poison sitting beside him. He laughed with full trust in his voice, and the sound broke something inside me. I wanted to scream, to warn him, to expose the people sitting at his table. But I stayed silent. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, my pulse loud in my ears. Evan reached for his drink, and as he moved, Clara's fingers brushed his again, slow and familiar. It wasn't the kind of touch two people shared by accident. They were careful, but not careful enough. I felt my hands shake as I looked at them. Two faces I once saw as family now joined in something cruel. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come out. My chest tightened as if I was trapped between two worlds, one that had already ended and one I wasn't ready to face yet. The betrayal wasn't just about love. It was about trust, the kind that takes years to build and seconds to destroy. My eyes drifted toward my dad. He was smiling, raising his glass toward Evan, thanking him for being such a supportive son-in-law. I could barely breathe. Evan nodded, pretending to accept the praise, while Clara's eyes shimmered with satisfaction. They didn't even look guilty. It was as if they had decided their secret was untouchable. I turned my face away, pretending to adjust a napkin, trying to steady my heartbeat. Every sound around me seemed distant. The clinking of glasses, the low murmur of voices, the faint song playing from the old radio. I felt like I was outside of myself, watching a scene that didn't belong to me anymore. For the rest of the dinner, I barely spoke. I smiled when someone looked my way, but my thoughts were already far from that table. Beneath the calm surface, I was breaking apart piece by piece, holding back the storm that wanted to escape. That night, the truth settled in my chest like a blade. The man I had built a life with, and the woman my father trusted most, had torn through both families in one act of selfishness. And as I sat there, surrounded by laughter, I realized nothing would ever be the same again. The noise of celebration faded behind me as I rose from the table. My hands were steady, though everything inside me trembled. The last thing I wanted was a scene. My daughter was still upstairs, unaware that the world she knew had just fallen apart. I forced a small smile and told my dad that Lila wasn't feeling well, that we should head home early. He looked concerned but didn't question me. He never imagined that his kindness was being repaid with betrayal sitting right beside him. Clara leaned back in her chair, pretending to care. "Oh no, I hope she's okay," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. I nodded, unwilling to meet her eyes. Evan glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable, but he didn't stop me. That told me everything I needed to know. His silence was its own confession. I excused myself, went upstairs, and found Lila sitting on the bed, her face pale and frightened. I told her softly that we were leaving. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded and began gathering her things. Even in that moment, her small hand slipping into mine gave me strength. Together, we walked down the stairs, the sound of laughter still echoing from the dining room. Dad followed us to the door, wishing us good night, his eyes gentle as always. I hugged him tightly, holding on longer than usual. I wanted to tell him everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could I break his heart on his birthday? So I smiled instead, whispering, "Happy birthday, Dad. We'll talk soon." He smiled back, completely unaware that the woman he loved had just destroyed two families in one night. Outside, the cool air hit my face like a wave. The stars above were sharp and clear, almost cruel in their brightness. I opened the car door for Lila, buckled her in, and started the engine. My hands gripped the wheel, but I didn't cry. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty. I drove in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the tires on the gravel. Evan didn't follow. He didn't call out my name or come running after me. That silence told me more than any confession could. I had been erased from his heart long before I found out the truth. The woman sitting at that table had already replaced me. When we reached home, I packed quickly. I didn't take much, just the essentials, a few clothes, Lila's school things, and the photo of my mom that always sat on the dresser. Lila watched quietly, sensing the weight of what had happened, but saying nothing. I told her we'd stay with a friend for a while, and she nodded, trusting me completely. By midnight, the house was dark, the bags by the door. I looked around one last time at the life I had built, the home that now felt like a stranger's place. Then I turned the lights off and walked out. No shouting, no tears, no goodbyes, just the quiet decision to walk away from people who no longer deserved to stay in my story. I withdrew into a quiet routine after that night, answering only when necessary and keeping my voice steady. His messages filled my inbox with polite questions and excuses, each one more hollow than the last. She sent notes that sounded like concern but read like manipulation, strings of sympathy that masked a smugness beneath. I let every attempt slide across the surface, never returning fire. Calm was my cover while other plans took shape. During daylight hours, I kept my life ordinary. School runs, groceries, reading lists, small chores. I smiled for Lila and tucked her hair behind her ear the same way I always had. With neighbors and friends, I stayed composed, offering the same gentle replies and avoiding prying eyes. At night, when the house was still, the silence became a blank canvas I could use. I collected facts in secret. Receipts, timestamps, offhand remarks. Nothing dramatic by itself, but together they mapped a history of deception. I watched patterns, unfamiliar hotel names, late transfers, oddly timed meetings. I traced threads through emails and bank statements until the web made sense. The work was steady, like assembling a device that would do what I could not. I didn't rush. Patience turned into a weapon. Outside appearances mattered. I met his calls with a neutral tone, never betraying the turmoil under my skin. When she reached out with faux kind words, I replied briefly, as if the exchange were business. People assumed the crisis had passed because I moved through public spaces without collapse. That made their guard fall. It also gave me room to operate. If they believed I had forgiven, they stopped watching closely. Lila's questions were few. She noticed the quiet, the small changes, but she trusted me. I answered with warmth and careful honesty, protecting her from the uglier truths until the moment came when she would need to understand. Her safety was my compass. I aimed every decision toward keeping her stable. The thought of involving her in a scene seemed cruel, so I kept plans tucked away from her bedtime story. At times I tested the edges. I let him think he still held sway, returning a curt message here, a short conversation there. His voice over the line revealed fatigue and something like expectation. He sounded used to getting what he wanted. Each call revealed more, the cadence of his lies, the gaps where truth should be. I stored those sounds like evidence. I kept everything legal, deliberate, and precise. No impulsive confrontations, no public drama. The goal was ruin without spectacle, expose the arrangement, remove access to comforts they stole, and ensure consequences reached both conspirators. It would be clean, surgical. The months of restraint hardened into resolve. Each day I layered documents, confirmations, and safe copies in a place only I could find. There were nights when anger rose hot and sharp, but I met it with planning rather than outcry. I converted rage into lists and locked them behind a schedule. Slowly, the quiet became the most dangerous thing in the room. When the moment arrived, they would not see it coming. They would only feel the collapse of every advantage they'd assumed was theirs. I was patient, and patience ultimately became my final tool of reckoning. The thought that Clara had tied my father's savings into Evan's company nagged at me until I could no longer ignore it. I began quietly tracing paper trails and digital footprints, piecing together a pattern that spoke louder than any accusation. Bank statements showed odd debits timed with supposed projects. Payment memos referenced vendors I could not find. A few scanned documents bore names and marks that didn't sit right with me. Small signs at first, but together they formed a picture I couldn't overlook. I worked in the margins of my days, slipping into folders and reading folders that felt like trespassing. Old invoices, archived messages, and PDFs stored on a forgotten flash drive all came alive under my attention. Some entries were altered, numbers changed here, initials added there. I printed copies, highlighted discrepancies, and made neat stacks of anything that confirmed the same ugly truth. Money had been funneled where it shouldn't have gone. When I found records showing transfers directed toward accounts tied to Evan's enterprise, the knot in my chest tightened. A ledger entry matched a hotel charge from a night he'd claimed to be elsewhere. Another line matched a deposit to a shell name that, when I dug deeper, led back to Clara. It felt surreal to follow these threads from one ledger to the next, watching how carelessness and greed left tracks. I kept a careful record of each finding, logging dates, times, and sources. I made copies and hid originals in a safe place. For Lila's sake, I made sure nothing could be lost or dismissed as mistake. Each piece of paper and every screenshot became a small victory against the numbness that had settled over me since that terrible evening. When the stack finally felt complete enough, I drove to my father's house with the evidence in the passenger seat. The drive felt long, though it was only a short trip across town. I rehearsed what I would say and how I would present the material without shaking. My hands were steady, but my heart pounded as I knocked on his familiar door. He let me in with the same warm smile he always wore. I didn't waste time. I spread the documents on his kitchen table and walked him through them, pointing to the transfers, the altered fields, the accounts with names that led back to people he trusted. I watched his expression change like weather shifting. The color drained from his face and his breath shortened. For a moment he stared at the pages in disbelief. Then his eyes met mine, full of hurt and confusion. He listened to the slow, careful explanation I offered, the way a man tries to understand a map that suddenly makes no sense. At the end, he closed his hands into tight fists and pushed back from the table. There was a silence heavy enough to sit on. Then, with a voice that trembled but held resolve, he reached for his phone. He didn't debate. He dialed a number he'd used before in serious matters and spoke to the other end with an urgency I'd never heard from. Within minutes he arranged for a meeting with someone who could make these papers mean something in the right rooms. He moved with the quiet decisiveness of someone learning they'd been betrayed and determined to act. That night the comfortable map of our lives shifted. Plans were made, accounts frozen, and questions prepared. I left his house feeling both relieved and hollow. Relieved that the truth had a place to go. Hollow because the cost of exposing it would be enormous. Still, for the first time since the birthday, I felt a small, iron steadiness settle in my chest. The next steps would be hard, but they would be honest. Everything unraveled faster than I had imagined. Once the lawyers and investigators began their work, layers of deceit peeled away one after another. Numbers that once looked harmless now spelled out theft in plain sight. Clara's name appeared on documents she had no authority to sign, and her trails of transfers linked directly to the accounts she had shared with Evan. My father, a man who had always believed in honesty, faced the shock of seeing his trust turned into a weapon against him. Meetings followed, quiet rooms filled with folders, statements, and witnesses. My father sat through them with a kind of frozen calm, his jaw tight, eyes focused ahead. The truth was heavy, but there was no escaping it anymore. The financial advisor confirmed that money had been siphoned steadily for months, disguised under consulting fees. When confronted, Clara tried to twist her way out of it, feigning surprise, claiming it was a misunderstanding. But the evidence spoke for itself, and the lies crumbled one by one. The fallout hit Evan next. His company, already unstable, couldn't survive the investigation that followed. Once his accounts were examined, patterns matched Clara's dealings, linking their so-called business partnership to fraudulent transfers. Partners withdrew, clients disappeared, and his office doors closed within a week. He went from the confident man who controlled every conversation to someone whose world had suddenly gone silent. I didn't take any pleasure in watching it happen, but I didn't feel pity either. Justice had its own kind of stillness, one that filled the spaces where anger used to live. My father, after finalizing the legal complaints, filed for divorce. His words were brief, measured, and final. For years he had been kind to her, giving her everything she asked for, but betrayal left nothing standing. He moved out of his own house for a few days while the papers went through, too wounded to stay among the memories she had poisoned. Evan reached out soon after, calling from a number I didn't recognize. I ignored the first few attempts, but one evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. His voice sounded small, stripped of its old confidence. He talked about mistakes, about confusion, about wanting another chance. Every sentence was built on excuses. I listened in silence, waiting for something that resembled truth, but it never came. He said he missed our life together, missed Lila, missed the home we'd built. But as he spoke, all I could see was that night, Clara's hand beneath the table, his quiet acceptance of her touch, the moment everything shattered. I felt the same ache in my chest, but this time it wasn't pain, it was clarity. When he finally stopped speaking, I said only one thing. My voice was steady, my words sharp as glass. You and Clara can rot in each other's lies. Then I ended the call, cutting off whatever hope he thought he still had. Afterward, I stood by the window, breathing in the cool air of evening. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like release, the calm that comes after a long, hard storm, when everything false has finally fallen away. A year slipped by, and the quiet around my father's house finally began to feel like peace instead of loss. The rooms that once carried tension now smelled of fresh paint and coffee in the mornings. The walls no longer echoed with secrets, only the sound of steady breathing and calm conversation. My father had replaced the furniture, changed the curtains, even planted new flowers outside the porch. It was his way of erasing the shadows that once lived there. He looked stronger now, his shoulders relaxed when he spoke. The bitterness that had marked his voice after everything had faded into something softer, steadier. He spent more time tending his small garden, talking to neighbors, fixing old tools that had been left to rust. Watching him heal taught me something about patience. Wounds don't close when you want them to. They close when they're ready. My own life had found a new rhythm too. Lila and I settled into a small place closer to her school. She laughed more easily these days, her smile brighter, her confidence returning with time. She no longer looked over her shoulder when someone mentioned her father's name. She had seen what strength looked like, not in anger, but in quiet persistence. That mattered more to me than anything else. I had gone back to work, rebuilt my savings, and surrounded myself with people who reminded me what genuine kindness sounded like. Evenings were simple. Dinners on the balcony, music playing softly, books scattered on the coffee table. I learned to breathe again without the weight of deception pressing against my ribs. Some nights, when the wind carried the faint scent of rain, I'd think of the woman I used to be, the one who tried to keep peace by ignoring her own instincts. I didn't hate her anymore. I just knew she had finally learned to listen. My father and I often shared quiet dinners now, just the two of us and Lila, laughter echoing across the same table where everything had once fallen apart. There was no bitterness left in those moments, only the deep understanding that pain doesn't have to define what comes after. It can shape it into something stronger. Once, Lila asked me if I'd ever forgiven them. I told her forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing peace over poison. I don't wish them harm anymore. Life had already done what it needed to do. The truth caught up to them without me lifting another finger. That was enough. Standing in the backyard one afternoon, watching the sunlight scatter through the trees, I realized that the same fire that had destroyed everything had also cleared the path for something. Betrayal had forced me to rebuild, but it had also stripped away every false thing I once held on to. My father smiled from his porch. Lila's laughter rang across the grass. And for the first time, I felt the weight truly lift. Sometimes destruction isn't the end. It's the beginning you never expected, the moment you finally see who you were meant to become. Do you think I did the right thing by walking away? Or should I have forgiven them and tried again? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if my story moved you, don't forget to subscribe.